The purpose of business communication is to inform, influence, and affect the attitudes, feelings, and behaviors of others for a specific business intent. Thing is, influencing and affecting the behaviors of others necessarily means changing their behaviors. And, well, we don't always love change. In many ways, business communication is about overcoming resistance to change and persuading people to embrace a new direction. I'm Dr. Lon Schiffbauer, and today we're talking about managing organizational change. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to recognize resistance to change, why people resist in the first place, and then how we can overcome this resistance when communicating. First, let me posit that resistance isn't necessarily something to be overcome, but rather understood. We all resist change, you, me, and we do so in both positive and negative ways. We're no different than anyone else. We want to maintain the status quo. It's a comfortable spot. We like that spot. So you and I, we've resisted change many times in the past, and we will again in the future. And this isn't a bad thing. But we need to understand why we're resisting and how we can help overcome this. But we can't do any of this until we learn how to recognize resistance. So let's talk about that. Recognizing resistance to change. Let's start with the easiest one to recognize, active resistance. Active resistance means that people are actively, openly, sometimes even in your face, resisting any change that you're proposing. They're arguing and negotiating, trying to influence which direction you take. Maybe they're even trying to cancel it altogether and come up with a different solution. Now, sometimes this kind of resistance can actually be really good. Somebody who is resisting in good faith, meaning they truly do have the best interest of the organization in mind, they may come up with ideas and points of view that you have not previously considered. This is especially important when you consider that any change that you recommend will need to be embraced and adopted by those affected by the change. And so, if the active resistors are given an opportunity to really contribute, it increases the odds that you can bring them on board when it comes time to pull the trigger on the change. On the other hand, if the resistors are not truly acting in good faith, then active resistance can be very destructive. You can recognize this when these folks ridicule the change or ridicule the intent behind the change, or just basically dismiss it as stupid and inane and ridiculous. They're not looking to help form a mutually beneficial solution. They're just basically out there to grouse and cause trouble. Still, they're actively resisting, which means you know who the resistors are, and even if they're doing so in bad faith, you can at least sit down and start having the conversation and maybe bring them over to positive active resistance, and in which case, you can work with that. That's good stuff. Now, obviously, this can get ugly, but I'll tell you what, I will take active resistance over passive resistance any day of the year. This is partially because passive resistance is much more difficult to identify. You don't really know who the resistors are or why they're resisting. Whereas active resistors are in the spotlight and demanding your attention and your time, passive resistors, they work in the shadows and they're not really letting you in on any of their thoughts or concerns. So what makes a passive resistor passive? Well, basically, a passive resistor is anyone who verbally agrees to embrace the change that you're proposing, but then in practice, they totally reject it. There's many ways that a passive resistor does this. One is by procrastinating the change. Yes, they know what it is and they understand what they need to do, but they just put it off and put it off, basically procrastinating it away. Another way is just by simply failing to take action. They say they'll do it, but then they don't. And later on, if challenged, they'll say, "Oh, I forgot, I didn't understand." No, they remembered They just are not embracing the change and so fail to take action. Now, the reason that things like procrastination and failing to take action can work is because of another technique that passive resistors use, which is feigning ignorance. They say, I didn't have the information I needed. The expectations were not clear. I didn't understand when I was supposed to do this or whom I was supposed to do this with. No, they had all that information, but it's really easy for them to say, I didn't know. And then finally, we have standing by. Standing by is basically when a passive resistor says, you know what, I don't think this change is going to stick. I think it's basically going to go the way of the dodo and be forgotten. So I'm not going to take any action because eventually all of this is going to fade away. And in fact, I'll just stand by and let it fade away. I will let it fail. So these are some of the ways that people, including you and me, some of the ways that we resist change. But now let's explore why we resist in the first place. Why we resist change. Sometimes we resist because the expectations truly are not clear. We don't know what is expected of us, and we're lacking information to take the action requested. Now, when this is truly the case, this falls at the feet of leadership. It's their responsibility to make sure that you and I have all of the tools, information, and resources necessary to really execute the change. Another reason we might resist change is because of complacency. Basically, we like the status quo. It's worked in the past. Why not just keep doing it into the future? And so we don't really feel this sense of urgency to change anything when things are working fine right now. Another reason we might resist is because we're being conservative. Now, similar to, hey, you know what? It's always worked in the past, status quo, right? We might also think, you know what, we've worked really hard to build these systems and to build these processes, and gosh, change is risky. Change really introduces thrash into the system. I think we ought to just maintain things, similar to maintaining the status quo, but in this case, it's loyalty to the old ways, loyalty to the ways we've always done it. That's more of a conservative approach. Now, another approach is just plain conceit, or another reason we resist change, conceit. We are so good. Nobody can touch us. We have always excelled. We have always been successful. The mere idea that we need to change anything is laughable. We've got this figured out. Still, another reason we might resist change is because we don't have the skills necessary to implement the change. So if somebody's asking me to change the way I do something, and well, the skills I have always served me well in the past, but this new process requires me to use skills that I plain don't have, well, that puts me in a tight spot. I'm going to resist that change. Now, similar to lacking the skills, a change may challenge our raison d'etre, our reason for being. Maybe we have always found a great deal of success and accomplishment in the way that we've done something, and now that you're asking me to change it, well, that sort of erases my entire purpose in this organization, this purpose which I have leveraged to great effect in the past. Why would I want to change the way I do something when the way I do it is core to who I am and how I identify myself as somebody of worth in the organization? Now, another reason we might resist is because we feel that the change is ethically in conflict with who we are, that on ethical grounds we cannot accept this change. In the past, our culture has been this, or the way that we've done business is that, or that. This change runs counter to who we are and our values as an organization. Another reason we might resist is we may disagree with the nature of the change. In this case, we agree that there's a problem. We agree that something needs to happen. But this change that you're proposing, this is not the appropriate solution. So we disagree that the nature of the change solves the root issue. And finally, sometimes we just plain get tired of change. You know how businesses love to change. The only thing constant in this world is change. Well, you know what? This can become overwhelming. It can really tax our cognitive resources and our ability to emotionally get behind all of these incessant changes. So, why is it important to take a moment to understand why folks might be resisting change? Well, the truth is, if we want to influence their behavior, if we want to persuade them to change, then we need to really understand where they're coming from. For example, what do they like about the current state that the change might challenge? On the other hand, what do they not like about their current state that they would really like to see changed? And is the change enough to meet their needs? Furthermore, oftentimes when we as an organization or organizational leaders are talking about change, we're talking about it in terms of what's good for us, what's good for the organization. Truth is, though, those who are affected by the change, they really don't care what's in it for the organization. Okay, don't care is a little strong, but trust me, what they care about more is what's in it for them. As organizational leaders, we need to understand the what's in it for me proposition, or with them. If we don't understand what's in it for the individual and communicate it in such a way that it has meaning and salience for the individual, then the change is going to fail. It's all well and good to just say, hey, if you're a good corporate citizen, you're going to get behind this vision. But that's not how most of us behave. Most of us are just kind of muddling through life and trying to survive day by day. We want to know what's in it for us and why we should embrace this change on a personal level. Now, whether we do so consciously or not, that's another thing. But whenever we're faced with a change, we're always doing this sort of cost-benefit analysis in our heads, with maybe a slight preference given to no change. Because if we accept the change, that means work. An object at rest tends to stay at rest. So we tend to put an emphasis on remaining the same. Nevertheless, we're always trying to evaluate, is this a beneficial change for me or not? It's not always whether to change, but rather how. Another thing to bear in mind is that sometimes it's not a question of should I embrace the change or not. Change is going to happen. The question is, which direction are you going to take in this fork in the road? For example, years ago when I worked for Intel Corporation, the company made the decision to close its offices here in Utah. This means I had a choice to make. I could either stay with the company and move to another state, or I could leave the company and stay here in Utah. There was no option to maintain the status quo. That just wasn't on the table. Change was going to happen. The question is, which direction was I going to take? So to figure out the best option for me, I sort of did this cost-benefit analysis. First, let's look at the pros of, say, moving to Oregon. Now, there would be great job opportunities for me in Oregon, and I could keep the same great Intel pay and benefits. And frankly, I really kind of derived a great deal of self-worth out of the sense of I am an Intel employee. And of course, there would be some significant cons to staying here in Utah. Almost certainly, I would lose some significant pay and benefits. And of course, the loss of the mothership, Intel taking good care of me as an employee. On the other hand, there were cons to moving to Oregon. There was no guarantee that the new opportunities in Oregon would pan out for me. And furthermore, I'd have to rebuild my life and all my relationships in the area, and not just me, my whole family. But most significantly, my career goals over the past decade had changed somewhat, and Intel may not be part of that equation. Likewise, there were some serious pros to staying in Utah. I could keep the life that I built here and loved so very much, and I had a chance to start a new business with a friend of mine from Intel. And finally, I could become a big boy and basically learn how to live without the mothership of this great big huge corporation. Now, why am I talking about this? Sometimes when we are proposing change to an organization and to the employees in that organization, we need to make sure they understand that it's not a either or. Either you accept the change or you reject the change. The change is going to happen. The question is, which direction are you going to take it? How to communicate during a time of change. Now, when we're managing change in an organization and communicating with those affected by the change, it's a good idea to bear in mind the transition curve, or sometimes called the change curve. And in fact, it's called many other things in many other sources, but the principle is still the same. We all go through different phases when faced with the need to change. Now, you're probably already familiar with some of the phases of this change curve. We're talking about things like anger, denial, bargaining, and eventual acceptance. So yeah, it's popular in all the media these days. And just as in there are any number of names for this change curve, there are also any number of phases and steps. However, I have found that for myself, these 9 steps really help me in figuring out how best to communicate and help people through change. The first is shock, bringing about a feeling of numbness. Everything seems unreal, as though it's all part of a bad dream. Next is denial. This is a feeling that this can't possibly be happening and that they'll probably reverse their decision before too long because in the grand scheme of things, there's no way they would really do this. Third is bargaining, in which we grasp for ways to avoid the change. Next is anger, bringing about, anger, fear, anxiety. Disastrous scenarios come to mind, insistence that this isn't fair, and frustration and suspicion of those making the decision. Then we have depression, which brings about a sense of dejection. Apathy starts to kick in, a feeling that nothing matters anymore. We become detached and resign ourselves to our fate. But then things start to look up and we come to exploring. We start to ask ourselves, well, what now? We rouse ourselves out of our depression and start looking at what actions or steps we can start to take. We start to think about the possibilities before us and maybe even start to envision a light at the end of the tunnel. After this, we have experimentation. We start to test the waters and see what success we might have as we work down one path or another, exploring all of the possibilities and dabbling in them somewhat. Then we choose or resolve. This is when we've done our experiments and we start to see where the most promise lies. We then make a switch to the new reality. We make plans, set goals and milestones, and schedule them to start making this new future happen. Finally, we have perform. This is the final stage, and it's at this point that we really start to see the benefits of the change. We're not just embracing the change now, we're grateful for it because we are so much further ahead of where we were at the beginning. The key to successful organizational change is communicating the right information to the right people at the right time and in the right way. For example, during the anger phase, don't tell people that they're being unreasonable or overreacting. No good will come from this. Instead, acknowledge that they have the right to their feelings and give them the time and support they need to work through them. During the depression phase, validate their feelings and be supportive. Remind them that they've navigated change in the past and they have the tools to do so again. Express confidence in them. During the experimentation phase, commend them for trying new things and for giving this change a chance. Now, obviously, when it comes to working through this transition curve, none of this is easy. But you know what? That's why we do what we do. And that's the power of communication, to help people through these very difficult times. And nothing is really going to make this go faster. Yes, you can help the employees through the stages of the change curve and help them move along, but you need to give them time to really work through the information. But that's where the power of communication comes into play. Communication allows us to influence the attitudes and behaviors of others. And by communicating the right information at the right time to the right people and in the right way, we can help them along. All right, so there you go. Thank you for joining me today, and until we talk again, have a fantastic day.